Welcome to our look back at some great recent NBR video interviews in NBR Interviews. I'm Paul Brennan, and coming up, National's housing spokesperson who says not enough houses are being built, a Kiwi expat on the customer and now employee experience, testing times for the Reserve Bank, and there's more. First up, the Matthew S. Abel Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of Auckland Business School and NBR contributor Rob McCulloch. In his latest NBR column, he asked, can we solve the problem of media bias for $1? Rob joined me to discuss his column recently.
The article's alluding to the dramatic drop in the value of many major news outlets like the Dominion, the Herald, even the New York Times in the United States. Many of those traditional names in news are worth a tiny fraction of what they once were worth. And so the article sort of asks the question, why did that happen? I think probably many of the NBR readers would be well aware that a lot of the decline in the value of papers like the Herald is because they lost the classifieds. That's been the main driver. They lost their classified advertisements. They all went pretty much to platforms like Trade Me. And it ended up that Trade Me was a company that got valued at a couple of $1 billion. And most of that value was just sucked out of the newspapers, which used to do all that work in the old days. But there's a bit of a catch to this story, and which is what the article's about. We all hear that the newspapers aren't worth much, and then people get, this idea that no one's really maybe reading them much. The owners aren't very influential. Who cares about them? Social media rules. But that part of the story is not true. The latest surveys report that over 2 million people a week are viewing the Herald, the NZ Herald brand. It has a massive readership and a massive influence, as does Stuff, which is viewed by between 1 and 2 million people. So people are still reading the news, and they're still going to a lot of the old traditional names in news, like the NBR, which has been around since 1970. They may not be buying and selling using Herald or NBR related sites, but they certainly are still, in a way, quite loyal to these old big brand names in the news. So the newspapers retain an enormous influence on what people believe and how they vote.
Yeah, it's interesting, the loss of advertising revenue, and you've given a few examples in the column of that, in an international sense. Yet that readership or that engagement hasn't dropped. So where is the actual value?
Yeah, so well, in the case we found out of Stuff, there was, in that case, practically no value. So it was famously sold for $1. And, the question is, well, there is barely any value in a lot of these old brands. So why haven't they attracted maybe interest from business owners to snap them up for these cheap prices? And probably it's because a lot of folks in business feel they don't know the media, they don't know the media industry. They're insecure with buying into that industry. And also you're probably, it's a company with liabilities and obligations, and they just, it's not profitable. And that's the main thing on their mind. So, the short answer is yes, and many of them, their values are a tiny fraction of what they once were. They still have some revenues from advertising, but they certainly have plummeted. The Herald, of course, is trying to get money through online subscriptions, and many papers around the world are getting traction on that. I understand the New York Times says the online subscriptions have been rising, and so that's accounting for some revenue for them.
Because the broadcast media would love numbers like that would put ad rates through the roof.
Yeah, that's right. That's the critical part of it. They've got the Herald, viewed a couple of million Kiwis, and apparently the papers like the Herald, the New York Times, since the pandemic, you'll find practically the whole country now will look at the Herald website right now, looking for updates on the virus. So there's been a surge of sort of virus-related inquiries. They're looking for that for public announcements. And so they're getting this massive readership, but they're finding it hard to monetize it. They've lost the ad revenues, and a lot of people probably are now clicking on the Herald, but they're not subscribers. They're reluctant to pay the, digital subscription. So they're finding it hard to make money out of it. And that's really the theme of the article. It's hard to sort of squeeze a revenue out of a newspaper, but they're immensely influential.
Just getting back to that one of the words in the title of your column, and that is bias. The two main, I guess, online news sites in New Zealand, there's probably not much between them in their reporting and I guess, to use that word, their narrative. Are you saying or hoping or just pointing out that there's some room in the market of positions that is unoccupied, that is available?
Exactly. Yeah, that's an underlying sort of theme of the article. It alludes to it maybe more than comes out explicitly, but that's exactly the point. That it seems that the centre right is hugely unrepresented in the media, certainly in this country, and you can tell that maybe through a lot of comments in the National Business Review. A lot of the comments on the articles we write are not that flattering to a lot of the mainstream media. There's a view there is a lot of bias there, and most of that bias seems more towards the left. And the question that puzzles me is when so many business folks and so many of your readers seem so upset by media bias on the left, why aren't they doing more to address that?
Professor of Macroeconomics at the University of Auckland Business School and NBR columnist Robert McCulloch. This is NBR Interviews, featuring great interviews popular with NBR subscribers. More houses are now being built than ever before, but National's housing spokesperson Nicola Willis says it's still not good enough. She spoke with our political editor Brent Edwards.
The bank's argument seems to be that we've obviously had not the same influx of people over the last year or so because of COVID-19, but now that there is a lot more housing construction going on, I think the most since about the 1960s. Do you agree that there are more houses being built now and that might have an impact on the housing market?
Oh, look, it's absolutely good to see more houses being built. Ultimately, that's what we require to overcome our housing shortage. I do think it's important we see those figures in context. It's often said that consenting is running higher than it was in the 60s and 70s. Well, only in an absolute basis, but on a per population basis, it's still well below those rates. So if we wanted to be building at the rate we were in the 60s and 70s, we'd need to see a lot more being built.
And does that get around planning regulation? Because looking at those Treasury papers, or some of the Treasury papers that came out around the budget, one of the pieces of advice they seemed to give the government was, yes, it was great what it was doing around dealing with demand in terms of some of those tax changes and the like, but that nothing would change until they made shifts on that regulation that would allow more land to be used for building. Not just through the RMA reform, but they were arguing in the short term. That still needs to happen?
That's absolutely right, and that is what National has been arguing for. What we've seen is that when we loosen zoning restrictions and planning restrictions, there is a supply response. In Auckland, the changes in the Auckland Unitary Plan have allowed more development to occur, but we need to see much more, and not just in Auckland, but across all of our major urban centres, across New Zealand in general. And what the Treasury is saying is what National has been saying, which is unless we deal with those underlying structural constraints that are stopping new housing development, then we're not going to get on top of the shortage. That's why National has put forward a package of emergency measures, which would suspend RMA requirements, would require councils to zone for more housing, both through intensification and through greenfield subdivisions, and would provide some infrastructure funding in return for that intensification and that development. Our argument is you can't wait till 2024 when RMA reform is set to take hold for these changes. You must do something in the meantime.
But is that national policy statement on urban development, which the government put out just before the election, won't that have an impact? I mean, I think people are arguing already it's forcing councils to open up more land for development, both on the outskirts, but also in terms of infilling.
Look, the national policy statement is one important tool for requiring more zoning for housing. But again, it doesn't actually result in changes in zoning requirements until 2024. So that is a long time to wait. I've previously suggested that we should bring forward the timelines on that NPS so that councils aren't just required to start thinking about it and start consulting it, but they're actually required and empowered to put those changes into action. National has argued for some time that when you've got an urgent supply issue, you have to deal with it in an urgent way. And yep, the policy statement does that, but on a very long timeline. So we would like to see it brought forward.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about housing affordability, and it's always around first home buyers. But I guess what about housing affordability from the point of view of renters? And is enough being done on these build to rent schemes and initiatives to actually get a lot more rental property into the market where maybe rents would also become more affordable?
Look, I do really worry about rents. They've gone up on $100 a week on the median rent over the past 3 years. And of course, that's a double blow for potential first home buyers who see house prices accelerating away from them and are also able to save less as their rents go up. And we're seeing that's putting pressure on household budgets across the board. I would like to see a lot more action in the build to rent space. That is purpose-built rentals. That's an asset class that has taken off in the UK, Australia, around the world. And when we talk to some of the people who've got money to invest in those kinds of projects, they say to us that New Zealand doesn't look like a particularly attractive place to make those investments. One, because of our restricted Overseas Investment Act requirements, and two, because of some of the new requirements on taxation around interest and around the bright line test. So National would like to see changes in that area because we think purpose-built rentals that can offer security of tenure and a really good quality rental experience are something that's needed in the New Zealand market.
You've criticised the government clearly over its failure on Kiwi Build and where it set targets. Would National set targets for, in terms of how many new houses would be built over a given period? Would you set goals like that?
Look, I think one of the things that has always characterised National differently from Labor is that we believe that the response to the housing shortage must be led by the private sector. That is, that any government initiative, whether it's the State House Build or Kiwi Build, will only be a tiny proportion of the overall housing market. And actually, if we want to get to the shortage in a systematic way, we have to reduce the barriers in the private sector that are preventing houses being built at scale and at pace. So we don't see that this is something where the government itself needs to be on the tools. We think it's something where the government needs to look at what constraints it's put in the way, what red tape is in the way, remove that so that the private sector can get on and respond to clear market demand and get building houses quickly.
National's housing spokesperson Nicola Willis with our political editor Brent Edwards. You're watching NBR Interviews, compiled highlights from recent video interviews popular at nbr.co.nz. Returned expat Shane Green was living in the US in the years when customer experience became the big thing for large companies. Green, consultant, keynote speaker, author and television personality, has worked with companies large and small in the US on how they can transform their employee mindsets, habits and skills, which in turn improves customer experience and ultimately team performance. He's now back in New Zealand and says the employee experience is hotter still. Shane Green joined the NBR's Dita Deboni. Dita started by asking him why he left New Zealand.
The big OE. It was the opportunity to go abroad, as every New Zealander has to do. They have to go and tour. They have the opportunity to get visas in different countries. So for me, it was always like, let me go see the world. That's why we sort of left. I always joke, New Zealanders get kicked out of their country at 21. Go look. The idea is to be back by 25. I didn't make it back.
You didn't go to London, which most or many Kiwis do. You went to LA. Why is that?
Well, my first visa was for the US. So normally it was a year visa. You get to go over, and then I was planning to go to the UK after that. I was very fortunate. I connected with the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company, sort of got a job, and apparently I was good at what I did, so they actually showed an interest in me. And so it ended up never being a necessity to have to go to the UK to have that great experience, especially in hospitality when you've got people from all around the world coming to your hotels.
And Ritz-Carlton, that's where you learnt about the customer experience. Can you tell us about what you learnt there, the nub of it?
Yeah, so it's about taking care of great service, but more importantly, it's about understanding the key moments. There's been some research done. There's like in a 24-hour stay at a hotel, there's about 1,000 touch points, little moments that could happen. We also know there's only 5 or 6 that matter. The reservation, the check-in. Every guest, when they go to their room, you might not realize this, they do 3 things. They look at the view, test their bed, and they turn on the light in the bathroom to make sure it's clean. So what I learned was that there's certain moments that you have to overemphasize. We always made sure that their welcome at the front desk was amazing. We made sure the farewell in the morning and little gifts that would go with it. So I started to understand that the idea that certain moments create the experience, which creates the memory, which creates the brand.
And you went on and took this message and expanded it for the NBA. Now tell me briefly about what you did there.
So the opportunity is when I left the Ritz-Carlton and I set up my own company, the NBA was trying to work out how do we get season ticket holders, people that spend a lot of money on the premium tickets. The lifeline of a sports franchise, as it were, is those people that they can rely on, not just single game buyers, but season ticket holders. And the problem was at the time they were starting to get an effect of like, if the team wasn't winning, obviously people wouldn't necessarily buy for the following year. And so they were starting to understand, how do we avoid that? What are the things that we could do? How do we create an experience, which means beyond just people turning up to the game, were there other touch points that mattered? And even within a game, was the touch point of just taking care of the fan the most important part of their experience?
And, I mean, you've been in New Zealand long enough now to have observed the Warriors and the All Blacks even, and the All Blacks just played a game which was very poorly attended, and people were saying, is this the end of rugby? What would you do with that franchise if you were to go in there tomorrow?
First of all, definitely not the end of rugby. But what we have to understand, it's not just about the game on the field. We've been so fortunate for so long to have the best team for like the last 10 to 15 years. So what have we done with that? And I think from what I can see, New Zealand rugby has certainly expanded and made the All Blacks accessible, the All Blacks experience. But the reality is how do you give them preferential? How do you make them feel a part of that team? And I think this is a very important part of it, is a season ticket holder wants to feel connected to the brand. They want to be able to put a badge on that and to say, I am part of it. I don't just follow rugby. I'm actually part of the All Blacks. And so I think when I look at whether it's the Warriors, whether it's any sports franchise, what are you doing to create more touch points out of the season where a fan feels they're connecting? But more importantly, what are you doing to make them feel like they're actually part of the success and failure of what your brand is all about? I remember with the NBA, I think one of the things they did really well was that every year the GM, the coaches would take time for season ticket holders, very exclusive events where they get to come in and ask questions and talk about it, but it really made certain fans feel really connected, that they were involved in a process. And what the teams used to do was to sneak out some information. They'd always have a piece of new information that had not been leaked. And so it was like they were the first to know. That's emotion right there. That's connection. That's fandom.
It's clever, isn't it? What brought you back to New Zealand after this amazing career?
Well, again, it's COVID. And again, I think it's like a lot of other returning New Zealanders. But it's not just COVID. COVID, I think, was a catalyst to suddenly say, my business wasn't doing very well with businesses in tourism, hospitality, and a lot of different clients we had. My children were able to do online learning, which everybody was doing. Well, we started to learn we could do that anywhere in the world. And as I started to look and go, this is the perfect opportunity to bring my children back to New Zealand. My wife was excited for an adventure in New Zealand. And so while COVID was the catalyst, it's so funny that as we start to look back, we start to look at things like crime, climate, all these topical elements that at the time last year in the US was pretty much, is this the environment that we wanted to be in when you started to compare it to what New Zealand offers?
Expat Shane Green with Dita DeBoni. This is NBR Interviews, featuring great video interviews popular with NBR subscribers. Natasha Burke was born into the business of beauty. Her mother Jane set up several salons in Palmerston North and gained New Zealand distribution rights for popular US brand Dermalogica. She bought the business and carried out a rebrand, launching 200 doors in 2020 and founding Skintopia salons, currently in Old Bank Arcade, Wellington and Commercial Bay, Auckland. Natasha Burke recently joined the NBR's Nicholas Shepherd.
200 Stores, as you mentioned, distributes Dermalogica, which is a skincare brand from America, which is sold in the professional skincare channel. So we have a network of customers that we supply across New Zealand, and they range from independent beauty therapy salons to department stores, Life Pharmacy and farmers locations. There is also an e-commerce wing of our business, and as you also mentioned, we have our Skintopia Skin Centres. So we have 2 locations, one in Lambton Quay in Wellington, and then a second location at Commercial Bay in Auckland. So all in all, we have around about 50 employees across our company, all women, and yeah, just a wonderful team that we work with, really.
But you brought to it a kind of entrepreneurial mindset. Tell me how that has actually manifested.
Great. Okay. Yes. So I did have a probably a slightly different journey as becoming a business owner, having come up through a family business. But I am someone who has always been very entrepreneurial, very creative, very interested in innovating and looking at how can we do things different. You know, if the industry is doing things this way, then we have a tendency to, we're going to do it that way. And a couple of examples, and perhaps one that I'll speak to first is, taking that bold move back in 2009 to look at e-commerce as a strategy for Dermalogica at that time. And looking back at the industry in 2009, really nobody was selling, no brands were selling direct to consumer. There were no strategies around that. Of course, everybody is doing it these days. But at the time, it was a bold move, and we looked at, okay, how are we going to do this successfully, and also bring our skin centres on the journey, because it was really important to us from day one that we weren't doing it to compete with our customers, but really to reach new consumers for the brand and to grow the brand overall in the market. So early on, we were able to launch something that we call our online partnership program. It's essentially an affiliate program. So when the consumer shops for Dermalogica online, they have the opportunity to select a Dermalogica Skin Centre at the shopping cart, and we then pass on commission on that sale to that skin centre. So it's been a wonderful program over the past decade or so, and we were really able to step that up last year during that first COVID lockdown. We increased the amount of commission that we paid to the stockists, and it's been a really powerful way for them to still earn an income when we've been, closed at level 4 or level 3 when they can't operate. It's been a real lifeline for their businesses and something that we're really proud of and that we do differently.
Okay, so what happens during COVID to skincare? Do people buy more things, splash out on more things and buy online? Do you have a boost in online that offsets the in-person sales, or how does it kind of shake down?
Yeah, look, I think that last year as an industry globally, skincare has done incredibly well. Just that category over perhaps others like fragrance or makeup that traditionally have done quite well. Last year, all of us talking into Zoom and looking at our faces on camera and Teams, there's been, there have been some things in the media over the past 12 months about a bit of an increase in spend in that area, women seeking out treatments, perhaps even cosmetic procedures in some instances. But certainly we have seen with Dermalogica a massive increase in demand for skincare online, and also within our skin centres when they were able to reopen as well. They've been incredibly busy, busier than ever. So our industry has done really well. And e-commerce for us, it's been, as I said before, it's been something that we've been doing since 2009. So, we've gone through quite a few iterations of our website over the years. We've built up a lot of capabilities within our team, a lot of expertise. So last year when COVID hit, we were in a really good position to be able to market to consumers that were looking for skincare online, whereas perhaps some other competitors were maybe scrambling to get their act together still with e-commerce. So yeah, it's been doing really well. I mean, traditionally we've seen growth of perhaps 25 to 30% year on year with e-com, and last year we had some months where business was up 50%.
200 Doors and Skintopia founder Natasha Burke with Nicholas Shepherd. This is NBR Interviews, compiled highlights of recent NBR video interviews. I'm Paul Brennan. Reserve Bank Assistant Governor Christian Hawkesby says the resilience of the economy will clearly be tested the longer we're in lockdown, but that it's far too early to gauge how it will hold up. Recently, he joined our political editor, Brent Edwards.
When we first got put in lockdown a week ago, the sense was we were at peak uncertainty, sort of not really knowing how things would play out with this particular lockdown. What we've learned from the last 18 months or so, we've learned a lot about how the economy operates under COVID. And I guess one of our big lessons has been just how resilient demand has been over the last 12 months when the country does get put into lockdown. Initially we did a lot of research on what's the implication on the economy of being in different levels of lockdown or being having the border open or shut. And what we've subsequently found is that actually it's been more a matter of timing of spending rather than losing spending and losing economic activity. It's really been a matter of timing and sequencing. And so that will be a key part of our consideration as well, how robust that assumption is that the economy's demand can remain resilient as we progress.
I mean, presumably the longer that it might go on would impact on your view as well as to how much of an impact it has. And I mean, clearly the governor, Adrian Orr, had made it clear that had we not been going into lockdown, we presume that there would have been an increase in the OCR last week. I'm just wondering how much longer that might be delayed depending on how bad this or how long this lockdown is.
Yeah, well, it has impacts on the demand side of the economy, but the other big lesson is just the impact on the supply side of the economy as well. We were very focused on demand 18 months ago, but in actual fact, the supply side implications have been just as important, if not more important. The supply chain problems, the impacts on the prices of goods, the difficulty getting access to labour, all of those, that when you add those to resilient demand, all of those are adding to capacity pressures and inflation pressures. And that's really why, as a committee, we came to that view that, the amount of stimulus that we've put in place to support the economy isn't really required anymore. And we can start on this path of starting to remove some of that stimulus.
Talking to Business New Zealand and others, they argue that small businesses, particularly obviously in hospitality, retail, that are dependent on being open, that they took on quite a bit of debt last year following lockdown, and that this lockdown, could be the kind of final straw that kind of kicks them over. And I guess particularly if they look at the cost of their debt going up. Is that something you've got an eye on?
Well, it's undoubtedly the case that some businesses will be more affected than others, and as you mentioned, the hospitality industry, those industries that are dependent on social mobility, social contact, they will be affected more. Our lesson over the last 18 months or so has been that household spending has been resilient and businesses have been adaptable. And probably more adaptable than we thought they would be 18 months ago. But clearly that assumption will be tested as we progress further through, and to what extent there are cases of businesses that have been hanging on, and this is the final straw. So, business confidence, consumer confidence, all of those sort of broader indicators will be really key as we look ahead.
You obviously stopped the bond buying program, but I mean, looking further ahead, when they come up, have you thought further about what you'll do when they mature?
Yeah, so within the monetary policy statement, we highlighted a plan to put out effectively an operational strategy of what we intend to do with our balance sheet, or the principles that we will follow. You know, we entered the large-scale asset purchase program to keep yields low, to support, the stance of monetary policy that the committee was looking for, and to support market functioning. As we progress through that program, the key feedback that we were getting from markets is that actually we could step back from those purchases because the market was functioning well on its own 2 feet, and if anything, having too large a role could create distortions or dysfunction in itself. But so that leaves us, now that we've halted those purchases, just to outline what the plan is from here.
Reserve Bank Assistant Governor Christian Hawkesby with Brent Edwards. The full versions of the interviews just featured are at nbr.co.nz right now, and join me again soon as we showcase the best NBR video interviews in NBR Interviews. I'm Paul Brennan. Thanks for watching.